Debunking Ecojustice Climate Kids Court Case, Part 3. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. Today we're going to continue our discussion of the Ecojustice GenClimateAction Kids Court Case, giving you some background that you'll probably never see on CBC. And you should ask yourself why. CBC is supposed to be representing the public interest and the broader views of Canadian society, but I've never seen any of this information on CBC. And I think it's important information to understand what's going on. So let's proceed. It's going to be a bit of a long read. I have quite a bit of information, but I think it's quite interesting and important. You can always pause and have a coffee and come back later. So I appreciate that you watch this, and I appreciate the many comments that people have left in the comments below the video. So please continue to participate in this very important discussion about our youth and the indoctrination on climate change against them and the exploitation of them. So without further ado, let's press on. So kids have been employed by green groups for a long time. Don't know if people remember Greenpeace's video from 2007 called Angry Kid. He was a nasty little fellow. He claimed that the scientific community released a report that proves beyond a doubt the Earth is getting warmer. Well, that doesn't establish a cause, does it? And then he accuses grown-ups of being the problem, and that if we don't take drastic measures, by the time this kid grows up, he says there won't be any fish left in the sea, rainforests and clean air will be a thing of the past, and the polar ice caps will be gone, oceans will rise, and entire countries will disappear. So 2007, and this is what, 15 years later? So none of those things have happened. And he does say that life will change in ways you can't even imagine, and that's probably true, but that's more because of the energy crisis and the machinations of the World Economic Forum rather than climate change. Now, many people are not aware that in schools there's an indoctrination process going on, and it's one that Ecojustice has been directly associated with. So I'm not sure that this particular presentation was related to Ecojustice, but we know that children are being literally scared to death. They're being told that there's a countdown, that we have no time left. They're shown this counter here, which is ridiculous. And this little girl came home, and thank God her mother's a fighter, and her mother went back to the school board and was really angry with them because, you know, they're showing little kids this information and saying you're all going to die in 8 years. So that's going on in schools. And so is this. This is what's called the 3% solution, and it's funded by all kinds of federal government money and other charitable organizations, and this is a charity, so it's already tax funded. But the feds have thrown in a lot of money, and I'll show you that at the end. And here we have Devin Page on the board of directors. Now this is from the brochure from a few years ago. The presenter of this was personally trained by Al Gore as a climate reality leader. but actually, Al Gore is not a scientist. So let's go through this. Debunking Ecojustice Climate Kids Court Case. This is part 3, assessing the climate claims in court documents. So they claim to be schooling politicians on climate. That's a little play on words, of course. And let's see if that's true. The case, as I've shown in previous videos, if you haven't seen it, it's based on 2 parts of the Canadian Charter of Rights: life, liberty, and security of person, equality before and under the law. So let's examine the climate statements in the Notice of Application. They state that climate change is an existential threat to all people living in all nations, but they don't distinguish between climate change of natural causes or those of anthropogenic causes until well into the document. And as illustrated in this image on screen, Climate change of natural causation can be beneficial in optimum periods, and these would be like the Holocene climate optimum and the Roman optimum, the medieval warm period, and the modern warm period. These are all times when humanity flourished. If you recall, in the medieval warm period, this is when castles and cathedrals were built. By contrast, times like the Little Ice Age or the Dark Cold period, this is a time when society collapsed into famine and despair and sometimes was virtually wiped out. So natural climate change can be an existential threat to civilization. And this is a very interesting graph. I really enjoy it because it's just so beautifully laid out. This is showing how dry, dusty periods and wet periods in a cyclical pattern have affected the rise and fall of various civilizations throughout history here. So this is before Christ. This is after. So these are very important civilizations that rose and fell, and they found this information by taking cores from Neor Lake, which is in northwestern Iran, and it's quite an interesting study. And ironically, dust drives climate change? Well, solar cycles drive dust activity. So in the scientific study that is linked here, he adds that the higher fluxes of dust are attributed to drier conditions across the region over the past 5,000 years. And this is a separate study that associates solar cycles and dust activity over Iraq in the same region. Now, there's a group called the International Union of Geological Sciences, which is over 121 national members, representing over 1 million geoscientists, is one of the world's largest scientific organizations. And they have determined that we are in the Meghalian stage or age of the Holocene epoch, not the Anthropocene. And they even say that they have an Anthropocene working group in their organization, but they've never submitted a formal proposal to the Commission on Stratigraphy for evaluation. Why? That's a very interesting question. So they don't see the Anthropocene as the period that we're in now. We're in the Meghalian, which started about 4,200 years ago with a drop in temperature and drought. So history offers important perspective, and these are two wonderful books. I love them very much, and also this Cold Welcome. These two books are by Brian Fagan, same author, and what I love about these books is that they use human records. So you're actually reading bits and pieces of people's diaries as well as all kinds of other anthropological information. And then he's also included a bit of climate science in sidebars. You know, most of it is quite understandable, but even if you don't read that, you can certainly understand that in the warming period of the medieval time, it was a fabulous time, a development of civilization. And then when we went into the Little Ice Age, things really fell apart, and it was very difficult. And for Canadians, you'll really love this, A Cold Welcome. Because a lot of people who came to North America from Europe thought that since we're on the same latitude, we'd have the same kind of conditions here. In fact, they often referred to North America as the New Andalusia, like of Spain, but it's just not that way. So anyway, these are two books that can give you some perspective on climate change of today. Now, if we examine the climate statements in the Ecojustice Notice of Application, they state there's a scientific consensus that a failure to take urgent steps over the next 11 years will lead to catastrophic consequences. But in fact, in this press release from AP, it says that the co-chairman of the report that this crisis claim seems to have originated from, the co-chairman of it said, "We did not say we have 12 years left to save the world." Okay, so he would know, because he actually is the co-chairman. And another person associated with it said the report never said we have only 12 years left. So we should stop telling that to children, because then children think they have no future, and that's simply not true. Now, in Charter's section, Life, Liberty, and Security of Person, the Ecojustice court case claims that governments must act now to avoid disaster. Ontario has not met this challenge, and to the contrary, they say that Ontario has abdicated a responsibility that it owes to all Ontarians. And so that's where they claim that their constitutional rights were violated. But if you read Robert Lyman's report on the Ontario Government Climate Legacy, referring to the Green Energy Act legacy, you'll find that this was catastrophic for many Ontarians. Ontario's disastrous electricity policy has been publicized, but what's news is to lay the blame squarely at the door of climate policy and remind people of how high the bill has been. So they spent $9 billion on poor contracting practices, $133 billion in global adjustment fees, and about 20% of that relates to renewable energy, $3.6 billion to build the smart grid and smart meters, up to $55 billion in deferred costs that will hit future ratepayers. So that's the GenClimateAction kids. You're going to be paying $55 billion for these terrible Green Energy Act policies, and 75,000 people lost industrial jobs. That's quite the tally for zero global environment benefit. And certainly, those governments did abdicate the responsibility that they owed to all Ontarians. Did they not? Because these people are now poor or out of work. And so the Ecojustice case argues for equality before and under the law and equal protection and benefit of the law. But by 2015, Ontario saw a 35% jump in the number of senior citizens visiting food banks. So of course, seniors often live on small fixed pensions. Any rise in electricity prices wipes out their budget. So the Green Energy Act, which is the kind of policies that the Gen Climate kids are advocating for, it was a very bad bargain for Ontario. And this is from a Fraser Institute report. But you can see here that the residential electricity costs, that's for the home, increased by 71%. And Toronto residents in 2016 were paying $60 more per month than the average Canadian for electricity. How is that equal? Now, the Ecojustice GenClimateAction case also makes this claim, that the kids are alarmed that Canada is rapidly warming at twice the rate of the global average. Well, you know, if you just look at headlines around the world, you find that this is a very popular headline with media everywhere, and it obviously can't be true, because not everywhere can be warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. So it's just media hype, and it's not true. But is Canada warming? It is. And we saw in Professor William Van Wijngaarden's work in the previous video that in fact he assessed 250 million data points, and he found that yes, indeed, there is 5 degrees Celsius warming affecting primarily Western Canada and the Mackenzie River Basin. But look carefully at these maps. When is that happening? That's happening in winter. And so our research director, Ken Gregory, did an assessment of Inuvik, and he found that yes, indeed, there is a rise in temperature in Inuvik in winter. That's very important, because here he says the summer high temperatures in Inuvik increased by an insignificant 0.2 degrees Celsius from 1957 to 2010. Since the dot size on Professor Wijngaarden's map, the one we just looked at, appears to indicate about 2 degrees Celsius for the daily average, most of the temperature rise must be the rise of minimum nighttime temperatures. The 5 degrees Celsius figure, our research director says, is misleading as it's mostly nighttime warming in winter. Summer and fall warming was much less. So he says the average daily maximum temperatures over parts of the Yukon and Northwest Territories in the 50 to 70 degree north latitude region increased 1.9 degrees Celsius in 62 years, or 0.31 degrees Celsius per decade, which that's pretty immeasurable, indistinguishable. The average daily maximum temperature rise in the Yukon and Western Northwest Territories was 1.9 degrees Celsius in 62 years, or 0.31 degrees Celsius per decade. Now, so people might say, oh, well, that proves that there's warming going on. So that proves anthropogenic global warming is causing it. But that's not true. The fact that there's warming somewhere, or even warming globally, does not tell us what the cause is. It just tells us that things are warming. And some of these amounts of warming are extremely small. So you have to take these things with a bit of a grain of salt. Let's continue with this, and I'll show you a reference to another point in the Arctic that actually disproves the AGW theory. So let me just find this. Sorry about that. So if we look at Utqiagvik in Barrow, that's formerly Barrow, Alaska, we find that there's evidence of warming, but it's not proof of causation, and in this case it proves the opposite. And this is posted on our blog, so you can go through the PowerPoint and have a look. But there's a non-correlation of empirical carbon dioxide and temperature trends, meaning that temperature may be going up, but carbon dioxide isn't driving it. So the Ecojustice GenClimateAction case makes these claims over here on the sidebar. They claim that the kids know there's a scientific consensus that climate change is leading to more frequent and severe wildfires, intense and numerous heat waves, floods, increased risk of dangerous and fatal infectious disease, rapidly melting northern landscapes, cascading environmental destruction. Well, I think that it would be helpful if kids had a look at the videos of our event. First of all, Dr. Madhav Kandekar shows that climate change and extreme weather is really about perception versus reality. And so he's got a detailed presentation and also a number of short videos. And Marijn Pools is a very interesting young man. Now, he's worked in conflict and poverty countries around the world. He's done about 50 films. He's very left-wing, and he came home and started questioning climate change, and nobody would talk to him. But he did interview a number of very key scientists. One of the people he interviewed is Hans van Storch. Now, Dr. Hans van Storch is one of the eminent scholars in the field of human causation of global warming and climate change. But in the interview with him, van Storch said, well, climate change is important, but it's not the most important thing. And he was opposed to the idea that people should be scaring kids about it. And he felt there were many other things that we need to address in society. We shouldn't address climate change to the exclusion of other important things. So you can see those interviews on our YouTube page. But, very interesting that this young man took it upon himself, funded his own documentaries, and went out there and asked experts their divergent and dissenting views. So he's not a climate denier. He's just a person with questions. And that's what every person should have. And every person should have the ability and freedom to ask questions. That's what democracy is actually about. So let's proceed. So The evidence does not support the claims of extreme weather events, and we've got this open letter to Ecojustice Executive Director Devin Page, which is posted on our website and was posted last fall. So it's not something we prepared for this event, but let's quickly look at some of the graphs. So wildfires are down, crop yields are up, prairie droughts are down, global droughts are down. Heat waves are down, global deaths from natural disasters are down. So it sounds like what the Ecojustice court case says is not represented by the evidence. Now, also in their notice of application, the Ecojustice GenClimateAction statement said they, being the kids, also know that there are viable solutions to this existential problem. But what's lacking is the political will of governments to immediately take bold and decisive action. Well, governments should not take bold and decisive action if the physics doesn't support the claim. So this is a really important report and fairly easy to read by Robert Lyman and Kent Zare, professional engineer. And this explains why renewable energy cannot replace fossil fuels by 2050. And one of the fundamental reasons why is that to get wind power, you need oil. You need coal, you need natural gas. So the more wind and solar that you build, the more oil, natural gas, and coal you will need. Not to mention, you'll need them for backup, for building transmission lines, etc., etc. So there are no viable solutions at present, and as we've seen, the climate crisis claim has been wildly exaggerated. Ecojustice GenClimateAction case claims a non-existent consensus on net zero. So they claim that climate catastrophe can be avoided if the countries ensure rapid reductions in greenhouse gases, and they claim there's also an international consensus to reach net zero. Now, just look at this. This is from 2017, but it really hasn't changed much. You can see that it would be impossible to have a rapid reduction in global use of fossil fuels because this is an impossible equation to replace fossil fuels. Any of these things take years, decades perhaps, to build. So, we're not dealing with reality when we're making these kind of claims or teaching kids to make these claims. This is not reality, and it's a shame because we're misleading them. And the good news, really, is that the IPCC no longer sees RCP 8.5 as business as usual. Now, this is from modeled scenarios that were meant for research purposes, but unfortunately they've been co-opted by various policymakers as if they are pathways to our future. And for the longest time, many studies claimed that the RCP 8.5 was our business as usual future when it never was described that way by the researchers who developed this, but that's where it was co-opted. Now the IPCC no longer sees this as our likely future, so there's no climate emergency. We do have time. And the good news from Burgess' study is that we probably reached peak carbon in 2019. And you can see here that both the EIA, BP, and Exxon have all assessed the emissions in the world, and they figure that we're, down here. So we're really more like at the RCP 4.5 level, and with continued climate policies, emissions reduction programs, emissions management, will probably continue to drop. So there's no emergency. That's very good news. And people who say they're working on outdated information. And unfortunately, the true deniers, that being climate activists, will not accept that climate science is using outdated and implausible scenarios. So this is from Roger Pielke Jr.'s article called The Unstoppable Momentum of Outdated Science. And he's saying that there's a considerable amount of climate science that's outdated, and this becomes uncomfortable knowledge because it challenges widely held perceptions. And So in such a context, we will see these kinds of reaction. We'll see denial that the scenarios are off track. We'll see dismissal that the scenarios are off track, but it doesn't matter. We'll see diversion that the scenarios are off track, but saying so advances the agenda of those opposed to action. And we'll see displacement that the scenarios are off track, but there are perhaps compensating errors somewhere within the scenarios. So these responses reinforce the momentum of outdated science instead of stopping it, and they make it much more difficult to implement a much needed course correction. So just to discuss that a little bit. So the point is that much of climate science is based on this RCP 8.5 catastrophic and implausible scenario that was never meant for policymaking. And now that we know that our emissions are actually more on track for the so-called 4.5, which is not catastrophic, and we may even have reached peak carbon in 2019. And now there's no need for this catastrophic net zero push. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't address emissions where they are detrimental to public health. It doesn't mean that we should forego climate action at all, but it does mean we can take a more measured approach. We don't have to be in a rush, and we don't have to scare people into compliance. We can simply plan things to gradually improve our energy sources, and whether it be that we ultimately do phase out fossil fuels because we invent or discover some technology that replaces it appropriately, or whether we continue to use them but with better and better emissions controls. You know, any of these things are possible, but we don't have to scare people. We especially don't have to scare children. We never had to scare children. And we can have open public debate on these matters and have a more responsible form of government policy that addresses the real needs of people, like the seniors that I noted earlier on. Pensioners cannot afford a price hike in electricity prices or power prices or heating prices. So if we are going to be equal under the law, let's be equal under the law and make sure that everyone can live a comfortable life with a reasonably priced electricity, natural gas, and access to fuels to get to work in your car and such like. So we don't need to scare people anymore, and we do need to address the fact that much of the science being claimed as the science today is outdated. So Ecojustice GenClimateAction court documents say the international scientific community also agrees that global warming must be held to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we find here in Foreign Affairs, Ted Nordhaus, who is the nephew of William Nordhaus, he explains that the 2-degree delusion is, it's ridiculous to have an unrealistic climate change target. And he also explains that his uncle is the first person who came up with this possible target. And the standard was, by his own admission, arbitrary. He came up with it 40 years ago. So, you know, maybe we should rethink that too. Also, the global mean temperature anomaly record is misleading. So, you know, people are always saying, well, here's the global mean temperature for the world, and wow, look, it's gone up due to this anomaly. When we use the anomaly, it's too much to explain in this video, but we have either access to this document on the CO2 Coalition site, or you can watch the video where I just did a read of it, and we have some pictures there that help explain why it's a misleading thing. And the Ecojustice GenClimateAction court document says, in a global effort to curb this existential threat of climate change, 194 countries and the European Union signed the Paris Agreement in the UNFCCC context, the Paris Agreement. Well, actually, Most of those 194 countries were developing nations that were bribed into signing on with the promise of a $100 billion a year green climate fund, which is to come from the West. That means that if they succeed in doing that, kids, you will be paying $100 billion a year to developing nations. And get this, countries like China, India, even Saudi Arabia could tap into this fund. Like, these are very powerful countries now. Even though there's poverty in both China and India, China is right on the tail of the US for the top industrial nation in the world. So any of these countries could tap into this green climate fund with no accountability. Meanwhile, bankrupt nations like Greece would have to pay into it. So the $100 billion has not been raised yet, and certainly not per year. So consequently, developing nations are proceeding with business as usual, while the West commits an economic and industrial massacre. So if Greta is saying that adults have stolen her future, well, it's because of these stupid climate policies. And you can read about the who cuts, who pays on this Green Climate Fund in Robert Lyman's report of a few years ago. So Ecojustice claims Ontario's lower target will lead to a dangerous level of climate change. And I bolded that here because it's quite ridiculous. Ontario's entire emissions are about equal to those of the city of Beijing. So Ontario is not going to create dangerous level of climate change with their minuscule emissions. And you should be aware that Canada is bringing 400,000 immigrants per year. So it's impossible to meet targets as each person increases our carbon footprint. So if you look at the past 30 years, our emissions were essentially, pretty flat, actually. That's because industry did make the effort to reduce emissions. The claims that government and industry have done nothing are completely wrong and completely misleading. So they have reduced emissions, but emissions went up anyway because we increased our population, mostly through immigration, by 37%. And let me just reiterate here, this is not a comment about immigrants. This is a simple comment about immigration. If you're going to bring more people to Canada, our carbon footprint will go up because every one of those people needs to use energy, especially in Canada, to survive. And one of the ironies is that most of the people who come to Canada, the vast majority of immigrants here, come from warmer countries. So we have people coming from China, the Philippines, India. When they get here, their carbon footprint is much bigger than it was back home in their warmer countries. So we have this oxymoronic policy or contradictory policy of claiming that we can carbon tax you into reducing emissions, that we can cap and trade industry into reducing emissions, and at the same time we're bringing in hundreds of thousands of immigrants, which will mean that we can't meet any of those targets whatsoever, and all of these efforts are for nothing. And in fact, Canada plans to bring 63 million immigrants. This is under the Century Initiative. So we will miss Paris targets by several miles. So, how much is a carbon footprint? Well, Darshan Maharaja did this assessment for us. He did the quick math. So the per capita emissions of CO2 in Canada was 16.5 tons. So if you want to imagine a ton of carbon dioxide, imagine a cube 27 feet tall, wide, and long. So that's a cube, and one that has these dimensions, right? And that's how much it would take to hold a metric ton of CO2. Okay, so about 17 of those for every person. So adding another 63 million people would increase our CO2 emissions by 1.05 billion tons a year. And then, of course, there would be housing and other services associated that also create emissions. So we have to ask ourselves, what kind of a joke is this being played upon all citizens, and especially upon kids? Now, the Ecojustice claim that the Ford government is failing young people, so they took them to court. But in fact, the federal government is failing everyone by demanding net zero climate targets while bringing in 400,000 immigrants a year. And not to mention, because we are in an energy constraint and an energy crisis and a housing crisis and post-COVID recovery and suffering a lot of debt, these immigrants are coming to a country that will not have the money to support them, not to mention that these young people will have to support them and pay for them. And in normal times, when we have a good economy, like for instance when we had big activity in the Alberta oil sands, we were putting through about $30 billion a year, I think it was, to the Canadian economy, and it created about 450,000 jobs. That was during 2008 recession. So, if we are actually making use of our resources and selling them to an energy-hungry world, then we do have the money to help immigrants settle here. We do have the money for health care. We do have the money for advanced education. And we do have the money for social supports. But we're not in that situation now. And in fact, the federal government is planning to do a cap and trade on the oil sands to even further reduce output. So, we're basically committing industrial massacre and economic self-destruction. And there's no need for us to do that. It's these ludicrous climate policies that are leading us astray. And unfortunately, our kids have been indoctrinated to think that's a good idea. And I'll show you more on that in a minute. So the Ecojustice Court documents also claim that climate science statements are uncontested. So in fact, climate science has never been assessed in a Canadian court of law. It's only been included as a preamble to constitutional battles. And judgments have included obiter dicta commentary on climate science, but these were not part of the ratio decidendi of the courts. So this gives the public the illusion that climate science has been tried in court when this is not true. And everyone should know, and they don't, that the Paris Agreement is a purely voluntary agreement, and it only asks signatories to report every 5 years on their progress. There's no legal requirement to meet any of the targets. Now, of course, Ecojustice claims the science is uncontested, but Ontario brought an expert witness who contests the Ecojustice climate claims, Professor Van Wijngaarden. He is a signatory to the Clintel World Climate Declaration, and I did talk quite a bit about him in a previous video, so I won't go on about it here. But, maybe the climate kids should actually take courses from him, because he's apparently an excellent teacher with very complex topics. And since the 2013 IPCC report, the evidence has shown that carbon dioxide is not the climate control knob. So Judith Curry has written a fairly plain language document that she used in testimony in the US on this very topic. And here we have Professor Emeritus Francois Gervais, and we have this in French and English, and he's discussing the cooling of climate sensitivity. So what do I mean by that? Well, initially it was thought that carbon dioxide had a very strong warming effect. That's what we call climate sensitivity, that carbon dioxide really warmed up the atmosphere. But over the years, based on the evidence, the climate sensitivity indicator has progressively dropped. And in many peer-reviewed studies, it shows that the climate sensitivity of carbon dioxide is less and less. And even the IPCC has changed their evaluation of the climate sensitivity of carbon dioxide. So on the good side, that shows us that we don't have to be afraid, and that carbon dioxide is our friend and not our enemy. And in fact, we're all carbon-based life forms, and we each breathe out 40,000 parts per million with every breath we exhale. But, if you're in a crowded room of people, you don't see people dropping dead. And of course, in terms of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is what plants use to grow. So, there's a symbiotic relationship there between humans and plants, trees, and all that. So, carbon dioxide is our friend, not our enemy, and we should update our science and not scare kids. So neither CO2 concentration nor global warming cause extreme weather. That's another very key point. More extreme weather and climate patterns were evident during the Little Ice Age, so severe that thousands of women and some men were burnt at the stake for the crime of weather cooking with the help of Satan. And CO2, based on proxies, was much lower then, and temperatures were much colder. So thus the scientific premises of the GenClimateAction constitutional court case are either incorrect, outdated, or disputed. And I suggest that maybe people have a look at our playlists. We've got 3 of the Marine Pool's documentaries, and then we've got dozens of short interviews with him. He's just a very interesting young man and done really adventuresome and thoughtful things in his life. And we also have a full presentation by Dr. Madhav Kandekar on climate and extreme weather perception versus reality, but also we have a number of short little playlists that might be of interest to people as well. Little short videos on individual topics like extreme weather, heat waves, and such like. Now, this is an important point, I think, in the Ecojustice case. I'm asking, is there a conflict of interest for Ecojustice? Because here's Devin Page, Director of Ecojustice, on the board of this group, which is a federally registered charity. And this group has been in and out of schools across Canada hundreds of times. And look what their theme is: empowering the final generation that can solve climate change. Now, if that wouldn't scare the pants off a young person, what would? And it says, climate change is not the only problem, nor the most important, but it's the most urgent problem. And we're the final generation who can solve climate change. Well, as you've seen, as I've shown you, even catastrophic climate change that took civilizations down was caused by fluctuation of dust in the high atmosphere, which some research shows was caused by solar variation. So you're not going to be able to solve that. You're not going to be the first or last generation to consider it and perhaps do research on it and perhaps develop forecasting for it. But you're not going to be able to solve things that happen in nature that are far beyond the control of human beings. So this scary little brochure, which was developed by an organization where the executive director of Ecojustice also sits on their board, seems to be kind of like manufacturing clients for future court cases. Am I not correct? Let's go on. So here's this organization, the 3% Project. It's operating under a charity called the Foundation for Environmental Stewardship, but they're actually just scaring kids with Al Gore's outdated science. And how is that a charitable activity? I don't see them in their brochure talking really about environmental stewardship. They're talking about scaring children. And it's an activist group. How is this charitable activity? The 3% Project mobilizes 1 million Canadian youth, that's 3% of Canada, through 5 national tours across 600 schools. It provides youth-friendly and holistic education on climate change and empowers youth to take action on solving climate change in their local communities today. Well, as we've seen, you're not going to solve the issue of high-altitude dust or solar cycles. As a result, we achieve more consensus across Canada that climate change is happening, mainly caused by human activities. But that's not what you should be doing, right? Should you not be teaching kids to use the scientific method to understand the science to assess whether or not human activities are the main cause, or whether there are equal or greater causation from natural variability? Should we not be teaching kids a scientific method rather than indoctrinating them? I think that we should. We should be just teaching them pure science and not attaching an agenda to it. But let's go on and look what else they're doing. So this is supposed to be a taxpayer-funded charity, but we find that they only have receipted donations of $7,000, or about 1.3% of their income. And this is from the CRA for the reporting period of 2021. But we find that other registered charities have given them 46.7% of their income, about $250,000, and federal government funding. Federal government funding was $150,000, or about 27% of their income. So in total, 74% combined from registered charities and government funding. So this is especially, I think, annoying. Oh, my cursor is stuck here, sorry. You know, as an Albertan, I think that this is exceptionally annoying for people who work in the energy sector, who are taxpayers, to have their tax dollars funding a group that's actively trying to decimate their industry, put them out of work, and create energy crisis in Canada. Why would the federal government be funding this charity, which is supposed to be funded by taxpayers? That's the whole principle of charities. Charities are supposed to be funded by people who are interested in that topic. For instance, if you're interested in protecting a little wetland, you form, maybe some kind of bird society, and you and maybe 100 local residents put together $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. You probably operate solely on volunteers, and all the people who support you get a little tax write-off. That's the original idea of charity. And I will say also that we have a letter from the CRA telling us that charitable causes must be local and measurable and tangible. And the example that they give is like a food bank in Halifax delivering X number of food hampers per year to X number of Haligonians. So climate change is not a charitable cause, which may be why they call themselves a Foundation for Environmental Stewardship, but then they subvert their activity to be climate change. So climate change is global. It's not a charitable cause. And all these charities that are exploiting kids and taking your money to take climate action to push carbon trading, cap and trade, renewables, they're doing it for commercial purposes. Maybe they don't know it at the time. Many of the people participating in it, I'm sure they are not aware that this has a commercial benefit to somewhere down the line. But that's what's happening, and it's wrong. If you want to look at equality under the law as part of the Charter rights, that's very unequal, very unfair, and economically destructive. And kids are going to have to bear the brunt of the economic disaster that we've created by not having sensible energy policies in Canada. So I invite everyone to have a look at our youth-oriented website. It's bilingual, French and English, and you can see that there are many factors that affect climate change. It's called climatechange101.ca. So have a look, see what you think. And there's a little bit here about us. I won't go on about it because I've done that before. You can read it at your leisure. And as I've said, I will be posting this entire series on our blog with the PowerPoints so that you can go through and click through the links and get more information. We're now in our 20th year of operation. If you like the kind of work we do, we invite you to offer us a donation of maybe $20 to celebrate our 20th year. You can send an e-transfer to contact@friendsofscience.org, or you can join us and become a member and donate on our main website. But I do want to say, if you're a little tight for money or you don't want to donate, that's fine. If you enjoy our work, please subscribe, please share our work, and we're happy to answer your comments. You can put them down below in the comment section. Again, thanks very much for watching, and I think I'll have one more kind of blockbuster deconstruction of the Ecojustice kids court case coming up, so stay tuned for that one. Thanks very much. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.